Our first reading today is Psalm chapter 32, verses 1 through 5. Happy are those transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Happy are those to whom the Lord imputes no iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. While I kept silence, my body wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer. Selah. Then I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not hide my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. Selah. Our second reading comes from the book of Luke, chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. Then Jesus said, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me. So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, but here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands. So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his slaves, quickly bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it. And let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has got him back safe and sound. Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a younger goat, so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him. Then the father said to him, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found. Here ends our readings.
The story of the prodigal son. You cannot begin to count the number of times that I have preached on the prodigal son. You couldn't count them on 2 hands. That particular story has come up 9 times in the course of the Revised Common Lectionary, so I've preached it at least 9 times in church. I've preached it at numerous other occasions where I was guest preaching, and I've studied it in Bible studies. The strange thing about it is that I have never preached on the same aspect of the prodigal son twice. That parable is what we would call a theological gold mine for ministers. We can point out so many things that occur in the story. We can point out the younger son's behavior. We can talk about the implication of the father running to meet him We can talk about the response of the older brother in terms of his comment, "This son of yours," possibly the highest insult that he could have paid to his brother at that time in the Hebrew nation. We could talk about all these things, but there's one thing that's always bothered me in this story of the prodigal son, and that is the seeming inequity of what the brother, the older brother, the brother that stayed at home, that seeming iniquity of what he has received. He complains, "Your celebration here exceeds anything that I have ever received from you." And he is angered by that fact. "You never even gave me an old goat to celebrate with. And here you've killed the fatted calf for this son of yours." He may have a valid complaint. I've always wondered about that, probably stemming back to the fact that my father hated this parable. And every time he heard it preached, would come home and say, "It just doesn't seem right. There's something wrong there. Is God saying that it's better to be a sinner and come home than to have lived your life through in a righteous manner?" We had in the 60s and 70s a great emphasis on what they called the born again movement. And people would say, "Have you been born again?" And many of us, myself included, would say, "No, I was born right the first time." Think about that. I was raised as a Christian child. Later, I learned what they were talking about. But is there room for complaint by that older brother? Now, the title of the sermon today is "The Other Brother." But strangely enough, I'm not really going to talk about that. I'm not going to delve into that. Because there's one problem when we confront this story that we all seem to miss because of the way it occurs in the lectionary. There is no other brother. There is no prodigal son. There is no father. There weren't even the swine that were being fed with the pods that the younger son longed to eat. This is a parable, not reality. And the problem that we have with this parable is that because of its great length, by the way, we're going to have to pay our lector this morning double for the length of that story. So remember that, double her pay. Because of the length of it, it's always preached on its own. Yet this parable is one of a triad of parables, all occurring side by side. We have the story of the shepherd with the 90 sheep, and the shepherd finds that one is missing, and he leaves the 99 in the safety of the fold and goes forward. And when he finds the sheep, he shouts with that lost lamb over his shoulder. As he returns home, he shouts to heaven, "Behold, I have found my sheep." Then we have the parable of the woman who has lost a coin. Not just any coin. If we look into a social science commentary, which I'll be introducing this congregation to over the years, but if we look into what the parable implies, that was one of her dowry coins, probably one that she wore for security reasons as a necklace or sometimes even a veil across her eyes. That was her security, and she finds one coin is lost, and she searches and searches until it's found. And like the shepherd, she cries, "Behold, I have found my coin." And she goes out and tells all of the women of the neighborhood, and perhaps a few of the men as well. Now we have the father and the prodigal son, and basically the same response. "Behold, my son who was lost is found." Same response, three different parables, all of them fictitious stories that Jesus has made up. But they all center on the same thing: joy. The joy of the person who finds the lost item, the joy that is expressed and comes through that parable down to us. Joy, the joy of the Father. Now, we have to be careful with parables because we cannot necessarily plug rigid identifications and say, in this case, the other son is Israel and the younger son are the Gentiles and the father is God and so forth. What Jesus meant us to focus on was joy. The joy of the recovery of one that was lost. The idea of rejoicing at the sinner that comes in out of the darkness into the light. That great joy that is felt in heaven and that we should be feeling here on earth. So why did Jesus tell us this parable? Did he just need 3 entertaining stories to pass the time of day? Or did he have a purpose in telling us? Surely his purpose wasn't just to tell us that God is happy. We know that. We know that God rejoices in heaven. But what does the parable mean for us? In the early days, for those who were converted immediately after the resurrection, or those who were converted to following Jesus before the death and resurrection, for those people, when a sinner came into the fold, there was great rejoicing because they too could remember. They were that first generation that could remember back to when they had been sinners. They could remember what it was like in that moment of conversion, that born-again experience that I mentioned before. They could remember that, and so they could rejoice with the sinner that had come into the light. The second generation of Christians most likely remembered the same joy. They could remember their parents' experience. They could remember perhaps when they were little children and as they had seen a sinner welcomed into the fold, and they perhaps felt the same joy. But then we start getting on to the third and fourth generations where there has been no contact directly with Jesus. And the people then felt as I did when a born-again would grab me by the lapels, unfortunately, and yell, "Have you been born again?" And I would reply rather smugly, "No, I was born right in the first place." It sounds funny, but unfortunately, there begins to be a rift between those who felt that they had been glorified by God and had been glorifying God all of their lives. There was a rift developing between them and those coming in. Somehow, the Christians that had been Christians all their life forgot about that joy and accepted a person back with limitations, with this feeling that they were somehow better than the new sinner coming in. They were somehow more glorified than that sinner because they had been Christians all their life and he was just a new Christian. We take this down into the 20th century, into our churches. And at that point, the rift had been developed to a point where perhaps we cannot recover from it. I have sat in churches, I have been a member of churches, and I have preached to churches where the people felt that the newcomers, the Johnny-come-latelys, were somehow second-class citizens not to be included in the church. Oh, they have spoken well. They've gone through the motions of saying, "Geez, we're glad to see you here." But they weren't. They weren't, because somehow they were the in crowd, and that new sinner was the out crowd, and there was no joy. I have been in a church where at Christmas time, the ladies of the church complained that the new people coming in were not helping with what they called the snowflake fair. And yet I happen to know someone that was a new member of the church that said, "Can I help out with the snowflake fair?" And the response was, "We pretty well have everything covered. We're pretty well set on that." And what they were saying in reality, and I'll pin it down, my mother-in-law was one of them. You are not one of us. You are a sinner and we are saints. That person didn't come back. I had a church in Western Ohio where on the morning during Joys and Concerns, a person had come back to the church, someone that was well known. They had been absent for about 15 years. And a gentleman took the microphone that we handed around for Joys and Concerns, and he says, "I'm glad to see that Pete Smith over there is back after an absence of 15 years. Had to point it out. Had to make sure that Pete Smith went from this to this." Pete didn't come back either. The man that pointed it out, I later found out, was a rival of Pete's in some manner in the church. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty. How are we going to act if we are successful in bringing people back? I have several ideas. Many ideas that I want to try first to bring the people who have left the church over the years, to bring them back to us, bring them back into our fold. And one thing I can guarantee you is that not all of these ideas, if any of them, may work. But we have to try. But there's no point in trying if we cannot truly in our hearts and not just with our lips glorify that person and praise God when they do or if they do come back. They are the lost coin, the lost sheep, the prodigal son. And our attitudes here must be that they are one of us. Because I'll tell you something, even though they're out there right now, they're still one of us. So we need to make sure that our motives are pure, that our attitudes are pure. We need to make sure that someone coming back to this church and then later someone coming in for the first time is truly welcome. We have to kill that fatted calf. We have to go out and tell it to the world. We have to rejoice as the shepherd did with the finding of the lost sheep. Because I'll tell you what, if we can't do that, well, then there's no point in trying. And in heaven, then, we will become another story, a failure story to Jesus Christ. So please, look into your hearts and glorify any who may come back to us, because they're a blessing from God. Amen.